All right, so recording has now begun. We will get going now with this projects that shift left for accessibility. So again, everyone, hi, my name is Jane Davison. I work for Minute. I'm a system analyst supervisor for the digital experience team at DHS. I have the honor of serving as your moderator today for this session, Projects that Shift Left for Accessibility. And again, this is the fourth session in our celebration of Global Accessibility Awareness Day. So let's move into speaker introductions. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I should have you go back. We've got two speakers today who are going to talk about how they were able to shift left or move accessibility left in the system development lifecycle. So I'll let them introduce themselves. Courtney, you go first.
Hello, I'm Courtney Petrosky, and I am a project management supervisor with Minnesota IT Services at the Department of Education.
Thanks, Courtney. And now Kim.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Wee. I am the Webmaster and Digital Accessibility Coordinator for Minnesota IT Services, partnering with the Department of Ed.
Thanks. And I know certainly, Kim, we have some excellent speakers for you today with a tremendous amount of experience. So you're in for a treat. And I just want to share a little bit about why this is important to me as well. As a supervisor of a digital experience team and a former digital accessibility coordinator, we know that for us to be able to improve how people find, use, and access our technology, it really requires that we bring accessibility into the project space very early, even in advance of planning sometimes, and bring accessibility in often. I also want to shout out to Leah Dooley. She's the digital accessibility coordinator on my team. And then we also partner very closely with Lolly Leski at DHS and Linda Shoemaker and Emily Cleveland at Minsure. So accessibility is super important to us, and it's important that everyone understand the state accessibility standard and find ways to make that really live in the way we develop projects. So it's worth noting that the current standard includes the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Sometimes we refer to it as the WCAG 2.0. But that you should also know Minnesota is evaluating what adoption of WCAG 2.1 will look like for state agencies. And so the State Office of Accessibility would like you to stay tuned for more information about how you can provide feedback before the state decides to adopt the WCAG 2.1 in the coming months. And with that, it's my privilege to hand this off to our CA, and we'll start with the next slide.
Hello, everybody. I would like to share the journey that we have taken at the Department of Education around applying accessibility through the life cycle of a project. Just some background of our project. In the last 10 years, MDE has worked to bring accessibility to the forefront as we are designing new applications. We knew that we weren't being consistent with how we were accounting for accessibility, so we decided to pilot a proposal that our accessibility coordinator presented to the IT management team on applying accessibility in all phases of the project lifecycle. The project we chose to pilot this with is our MinSimp replacement project, and MinSimp is our Minnesota Continuous Improvement and Monitoring Process application. It is one of our legacy applications where we face challenges to keep updated, provide necessary supports for the business, and it was decided in 2019 to research a vendor solution to replace the existing product. The product itself facilitates the capturing of student record reviews and corrections for non-compliance and program evaluations in continuous improvement and monitoring. So the first phase in our project is that initiation phase, where we were working with the business to do a feasibility study to reflect as is and work towards that to be status. Once the business and IT determined that they would want to go for bid, we went through the RFP process and we had our business analysts begin to gather requirements. Through discovery, we initially thought accessibility was a non-functional requirement, but realized it was a functional requirement. And this might seem logical, but it did really change the team's perspective, which became one of our first steps. Next, we developed our RFP, and during this process, it allowed us the opportunity to discuss accessibility and how it would be scored with the business and their role within that process. So during our vendor response process, we did 2 rounds of scoring for accessibility. The first round included scoring for VPAT. In the second round, we included scores during the vendor demo, and all of those that were scored during the demo needed to provide all of those individuals that were scoring during the demo needed to provide some score under our accessibility section. Before the demo began, we made sure that our business was comfortable and understood what it looked like during the demo in order for them to score appropriately. And this was where we began to get the business to buy in to the concept of applying accessibility and their part as stakeholders and champions for this. We also made sure in our process and planning we were budgeting and requesting resource time from our accessibility coordinator, and also asked the vendor to provide someone with expertise on their team as well. On this slide, we wanted to provide an example of what that score sheet during the demo session would look like. So we had 5 topics that the vendor was addressing throughout their demo, and the 5th topic was around accessibility. So we were asking the business that was participating in those demos to score around workflow automation, the sampling and risk assessment that was particular to the product and project itself, around being able to use the dashboard reporting and data integration, and then, like I said, topic 5, accessibility, where there was a score. And with this snapshot, we were able to point out to say, yep, keyboard is following logic. And this was not someone in IT that made this note. So again, having those pre-conversations before demo with the business to say, this is what you need to look for when we ask them to show that how the product works with a keyboard only, looking at color contrast, those various topics. In the planning phase, there are many project documents produced, but we want to call out in this presentation ones that we felt were significant in the conversations that we were having around accessibility, besides just like the requirements documents. The first being the comprehensive test plan. And during kickoff of the project, it was significant in the meetings to review the testing plan and the expectations around testing for accessibility. It was to make sure that the vendor and our state team both understood what types of testing was going to happen, and to understand the expectation that there could be multiple rounds of testing just based off of past experience, that when we're doing an accessibility test, that there are going to be items found that the vendor would have to go back, make those fixes, and then we would test again. So we knew that there was going to be multiple rounds in that process. The other document is our RACI document, and RACI stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consulted, and Informed. And so in our document of table, we're identifying all the roles within the project, both on the state side and on the vendor side, and what were the responsibilities of those roles, and wanting to just point out that we made sure that we had the role identified in our RACI chart around an accessibility specialist, and for the various phases of the project, what would that person's role be? You can see a lot at the beginning is around consulting and then informing, and then during testing, it is their responsibility to be doing accessibility testing. And I will now hand it over to Kim.
Thank you, Courtney.
Kim, you're muted.
It's working really slow on my end. Thank you. So I want to talk to you today about the design phase. So user experience and interface designers often create really detailed designs. So by including an accessibility review and annotation of the designs, we can not only review for branding, but also add valuable information for development. The more robust the accessibility feedback is, the less guesswork on the developer. On the slide, we have a screenshot of one of the project wireframes and some information about the accessibility items that can be added to a wireframe. For example, adding a skip navigation link, adding alt text to a logo, and other images on the page. And some of the other accessibility annotations that can be added are such things as a structure hierarchy. Think about headings, lists, and tables, the role, state, and value of every element on the page, including expanded or collapsed menus, descriptions of all interactions, color contrast, visible focus states, reading and focus order, touch target sizes for mobile design. Next slide, please. So towards the beginning of the build phase, the vendor lead developer and I had many opportunities to work together to review code and demo functionality. These deep dive working sessions were really helpful as they provided an opportunity to find areas of improvement that had bigger impact across the entire application. I also found that the more understanding I had of the backend framework, I was able to provide more specific guidance on how to fix some of the accessibility issues that I had found during testing. And for the developer, the working sessions provided a form of training and deep dive into WCAG guidelines that would have potentially took many more hours of their time to fix those issues. And as the project has progressed, the vendor has tracked and documented the many areas of improvement that have been identified during development. The improvements have formed the developers or the vendor's development guide and code libraries that include accessibility built in. The developers are no longer adding ARIA labels to form elements or info icons directly line by line in the code. This was a huge, huge accomplishment. Grids and responsive and color contrast, along with visible focus, is being set in CSS instead of inline. And we continue having our weekly meetings that give us that focus time to discuss anything from process improvement, testing, code review, and next steps. Next slide, please. So it's important to test early and often, start to finish. Since we identified early on that accessibility is part of the functional specifications, several rounds of accessibility testing is included in UAT, and issues are tracked with the JIRA issue tracking system. Early on, during some of the working sessions, I shared the accessibility testing tools and my testing protocol with the developers, followed by discussions and training with a broader group of folks on the vendor team. So because of this, the vendor has changed their process to include accessibility testing as a regular step of the process before pushing a new code to pushing new code to UAT, which then, so they do their initial round of testing Once they push it to UAT, then that's when I take and do another test and run through the testing protocol. So typically my testing protocol begins with keyboard only testing, followed by an automatic testing tool such as Axe or Andy, using the built-in accessibility inspector in Chrome, the color contrast analyzer, and using JAWS and NVDA for validation. All right, Courtney.
Thank you, Kim. So the last piece that we have, because our project is still active, so we haven't closed out just yet, but we have been doing many deployments in an iterative phase process. And through our deployment phase, we had go, no-go conversations with the vendor. We created the acceptance criteria and checklist to go over for each deployment. And in that checklist, there is a section focused just around signing off for accessibility. And through that process, we have learned over time what is our threshold criteria for a go to happen under accessibility. And what we created and identified was that anything that had a high priority or considered critical accessible compliance, that it did not, like, if there was still any remaining, it was a no-go. We would have to have 0 tickets that had that critical or high status to be fully completed before a go was approved. And we needed to have a go in all of the various sections for that feature that was going to go to production. And this really was a huge win, I think, for the business to make sure that they're getting the product that they are expecting in the end, because it wasn't just, oh yeah, all the verbiage is correct, there's no typos, and I can click this button. It was making sure all the deliverables and all of the features that were promised in our contract were being upheld. And I would share that there have been quite a few no-goes, and we've had to have a number of go, no-go meetings with the vendor to make sure that all of those like critical items, those critical 8 accessibility items, were all complete before a go was happening. So sometimes we've had 2 to 3 rounds of a review to go to production. Finally, I'd like to just share our key takeaways that we have learned thus far that I hope are helpful to other individuals as you are working on a project to think about applying to your project lifecycle. The first is to make it clear at the beginning what expectations are for accessibility. As I mentioned in the last slide, we've had quite a few no-go conversations, and that very first go, no-go meeting that we had early in the project, and there was a no-go, there was a lot of conversation, and we didn't realize at that time, even though we've had conversations from the kickoff, we had our comprehensive test plan, that there were still a misunderstanding of what the state was, what we as the state were requiring the vendor to complete. So after that, we did a lot of training, had a lot of conversations to really put us on the right path. And I think we've been really successful with that. Once it kind of became an aha, like, oh yeah, accessibility is really important on this project and the business is taking it seriously. And us as the vendor that's providing the end product needs to make sure that we're doing our due diligence on our end to complete that. And they definitely did. They stepped up. They made sure that they were putting the right number of resources on, but I don't think it was fully understood at the beginning. So I think in our lesson is to be try to be more clear around our expectations and our experience on future projects. Number 2 is just asking the vendor if they have developed a branding guide before development starts. Really understanding where they are at the beginning around accessibility, I think will put us as the state in a much better position for that conversation with the vendor. So if we know that, you know, wherever they are kind of on a grid in regards to experience with development with accessibility will allow us to provide good documentation maybe to them on even more on what tools we're expecting them to use, what resources they might need, and so forth. Number 3 is leverage the contract. Again, we were making sure that even when we were executing the contract in the statement of work, we had a whole section around accessibility and making sure that the role is clear on what that individual from the vendor's team would be responsible for. Number 4, the work and effort you put in with the vendor to help them provide a better product is going to be a win for you in the end. Kim, you know, we are so lucky to have her, and she has put a lot of work partnering with the vendor. As she says, she has weekly meetings with them to really review code, review the designs, and the work that she has put in with that vendor to help them increase their knowledge around accessibility or even how they're doing their coding on their end. It's not only going to help us with a good end product, but it's going to help that vendor for future products too, that they're going to hopefully take away from this that they can apply to other work themselves. And finally, the 5th one is request that the vendor provide that resource. Again, that has just been so crucial and a huge takeaway for us that if they don't have someone on their end that's knowledgeable around digital accessibility and designing that, it will be a lot more work. It could be a lot more work on our end with providing training or mentoring to the vendor. So on this project, the vendor did go out and reach out for developers that had that background and experience that could come in and help on the project. So making it, again, that as the forefront of the conversation early on to say that is an expectation to have a member with that kind of background or knowledge on the team is going to be crucial. So that is our 5 takeaways and the end of our presentation. So we are ready for question and answer.
Okay, first question is from Jay. He asks, when inviting prospective vendors to the demonstrations, how explicit were you about what reviewers would be looking for so that they could prepare?
Great question. Before every demo, we do have a call session with each of the vendors where we review like an agenda of what we want them to present. And we do give them a heads up to say, hey, we're going to ask and we're going to expect that you do a presentation with the product active and that you're going to have to show being able to navigate through the product with only with a keyboard, and we're going to expect to see some of those examples and have some of those discussions. So we do want them to come prepared. We don't want to just blindside them to navigate through their site if the presenter might not have as well of familiarity with the product, because as many of us know, it's a lot of the sales folks that come to the presentation and not always their developers. So them having a developer on hand for those parts of the presentation has been helpful.
It's really excellent. And Jenny, I'm now able to see the chat. So we do have one more question from Jennifer Dubus. And Jennifer, I love this question. I had the same one. It is, could you explain how you worked accessibility into functional requirements? We've always had them in non-functionals. So curious how this worked.
That's a good question too. And maybe Kim, you can partner with me on responding to this question.
And I should note we are at 12:30, so we're going to go over just a minute or two, but I think this is a good one. So take it away.
So yes, by moving it to that functional requirements piece, it really allowed us to navigate the conversations around accessibility almost being a deliverable in itself. And instead of kind of just verbiage on the side in documentation and agreements where we just kind of hope that was expected, but instead it was navigating that conversation to say, no, this is the actual functional requirement that the features in the tool need to be accessible. They need to have, alt text on all the images, buttons versus the links and all those kind of things are going to be part of the requirements. And so going into the details there around when to use one versus the other, or how it's supposed to function in itself in an accessible way, allowed us to get into that avenue. And I'll let Kim add anything.
Yeah, this is Kim. I just want to add to that, that, really the biggest shift here for us in this aspect really was the fact that, explaining and getting that buy-in from the business, and for everybody to understand that if that accessibility, the functionality of the product itself, I mean, if it's not accessible, it's not functional. I mean, it was just getting that buy-in and getting that mindset to shift to where people understood that if I can use a keyboard, just say, and tab to a form element or a grid, and or use a mouse to do those navigational type of elements. If I can use a mouse or just a keyboard and make that function, if I can't, then it's broke. And so that is a functional requirement. It either is going to be functional for everyone to use it, or it's not. And that is where the go, no go came into play, was everybody had to be able to use the product. It wasn't just some users versus others. So it was fully baking in accessibility throughout the entire piece of it.
I really appreciate that. This is Jane again, and I'll help us wrap up. But thank you for that last question and those great answers, especially differentiating between kind of, I think historically we've sort of assumed a non-functional translates to a nice to have versus the functional, which is kind of a non-negotiable. And I don't know that that's a fair translation, but I think that's sometimes how we've operated. So that's really excellent. So thank you so much, Courtney and Kim. You've not only helped us celebrate Global Accessibility Awareness Day, but given us some really excellent information. And thanks to those of you that were able to get at least a couple of questions in the chat. We will wrap up, but want to invite you back at 1 o'clock for the 5th session. That will be discussing document and content accessibility. So another excellent session. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of Global Accessibility Awareness Day.